Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The Whispering Shadow. I never thought much of the shadows in my room. To me, they were just part of the darkness, a natural byproduct of the feeble light that barely spilled in from the street lamp outside. But last night, something was different. I could feel it before I even opened my eyes, a thick, oppressive weight settling over me like a heavy blanket. The air in the room felt charged, electric, as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching, waiting. I sat up, blinking against the encroaching darkness. The shapes in the corners of my room seemed to shift, curling in on themselves, swirling with an unnatural life. My heart pounded. The sound of my own breathing echoed in my ears, growing louder as I scanned the room. It was then that I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no. The windows were closed. The voice was coming from inside my room. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper itself. The shadows recoiled, shrinking away from the dim light cast by my bedside lamp. But they didn't retreat entirely. One lingered at the foot of my bed, a shape darker than any of the others, nearly impossible to make out against the gloom. It was almost human in form, but distorted, as if someone had tried to paint a person and then smeared the canvas. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the remnants of a nightmare. After all, I had been having those a lot lately, ever since the nights had started growing longer, and sleep had become more elusive. But no. This was different. This was real. The shadow wasn't just in my mind. It was still there, unmoving, watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the clock, 3:03 a.m. The whispers began again, growing louder this time, overlapping with each other in an incomprehensible murmur. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning behind them was clear. I wasn't alone. I closed my eyes and whispered, "This isn't happening. This isn't real." When I opened them again, the shadow had vanished, leaving me in the oppressive silence of my room. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had haunted me in the dark was gone. But deep down, I knew the truth. The shadows weren't just a trick of the light anymore. They had taken on a life of their own, and one of them had stayed behind. Morning didn't bring relief the way I hoped it would. I half expected the light of day to burn away the memories of the night before, to reveal that the shadows had just been tricks of a tired mind. But the moment I opened my eyes, I knew I was wrong. The unease clung to me like damp fog, refusing to dissipate. Something was off, like the world had shifted ever so slightly, yet enough for me to notice. I swung my legs off the bed, feeling groggy and heavy as though I hadn't slept at all. I looked down, and my blood turned cold. The shadow was still there, beneath my bed, not stretching as it should in the morning light but huddled in a shape distinct and unnatural. I froze, unable to move or even breathe properly. It was as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I swallowed hard and slowly stood up, forcing myself to tear my gaze away. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a leftover paranoia from the night. Yet as I crossed the room, that oppressive feeling followed me, a weight hanging over my shoulders. Every time I glanced back, the shadow seemed to shift, creeping ever so slightly from under the bed, trailing me like a dark stain. "Get a grip," I muttered, pulling the blinds open with shaking hands. Sunlight poured into the room, but the shadow remained, stark and unmoved. My heart was hammering again. I couldn't help it. This isn't possible. I backed away, my breath quickening. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Clutching it, I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mia, my best friend. It simply read, "You okay? You look exhausted." Of course, Mia had noticed my disheveled state when we met up yesterday. I'd brushed off her concern, saying I was just dealing with work stress. I stared at the text, my fingers trembling as I typed back, "Something's wrong. I think there's something in my room." The response came almost instantly. "What? Like a rat?" she joked, followed by a quick, "I'm coming over. Be there in 20. I didn't want her to come. I didn't want to expose anyone else to whatever was happening here, but before I could protest, I heard it again, the whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I turned slowly, my skin crawling, and there it was, the shadow. It had moved. No longer confined to the underside of my bed, it now stretched, thin and sinuous, creeping toward the center of the room. Mia arrived just as the whispers began to crescendo, but the moment her knuckles rapped on my front door, the sound cut off, as if something had been silenced by her presence. I opened the door, and her face instantly shifted from lighthearted concern to a frown of genuine worry. "You look awful," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I told you not to come," I muttered, closing the door behind her. My voice sounded hollow, strained, like I was speaking from somewhere far away. "Well, too late," she said, shrugging off her jacket and giving me a critical once-over. "What's going on? What do you mean there's something in your room?" I gestured vaguely toward the door to my bedroom, my hand trembling. "It's hard to explain. The shadows. They're alive. They're whispering." Mia's eyebrow quirked, the skepticism clear on her face. "Shadows?" She crossed her arms. "Are you sure you're not just sleep deprived? You said you hadn't been sleeping well." "I'm not crazy," I snapped, more sharply than I intended. "It's not just in my head, Mia. There's something here. Something in the dark." She stared at me for a long moment before sighing and walking toward the bedroom. "Fine. Let's see this shadow of yours." My stomach twisted as I followed her, my feet heavy with dread. Part of me hoped that the sunlight had finally banished it, that I'd find nothing out of the ordinary. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. Mia threw open the door and stood in the threshold, arms akimbo. "Well?" she asked, glancing around. "I don't see anything." I stayed a few steps behind her, eyes locked on the spot where the shadow had been. And there it was, just as I feared, stretched across the floor in the middle of the room, as dark as midnight and entirely out of place in the daylight. But something was different now. It wasn't shapeless anymore. It was forming. Growing. The longer I stared, the more defined it became, a vague human figure, thin and impossibly tall, standing hunched near my bed. "Do you see it?" I whispered, my voice cracking. Mia looked back at me, her brow furrowed. "See what?" The air was thick with tension, the room cold despite the sunlight streaming in through the windows. I stepped closer, feeling the pull of the shadow, as if it were drawing me in. "It's right there, Mia. Right in front of you." But Mia shook her head, blinking. "There's nothing there, just your bed and..." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening, pupils dilating as if she'd finally registered something. Her hand reached up, almost unconsciously, to her throat. "Wait. She gasped, a choked, ragged sound. Her body stiffened as if an invisible force had wrapped itself around her throat. I watched in horror as the shadow figure shifted, no longer just a static presence but something active, something with intent. It was holding her. "Mia!" I screamed, rushing toward her. Her eyes bulged in terror, her hands clawing at her throat as if trying to break free from invisible hands. The shadow had become clearer now, its thin, elongated fingers wrapping around her neck, its dark form shifting between solid and smoke. The whispers returned, louder, and this time I could almost make out words, hollow, sinister murmurs spoken just beneath the surface of reality. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her away from the invisible grip of the shadow. But it was like pulling against stone. She was pinned in place, her body convulsing, mouth moving in silent screams. I could feel the air growing colder, like standing at the edge of an open grave. Panic surged through me. "Let her go!" I shouted, though I knew it was pointless. The thing wasn't human. It didn't follow human logic. The shadow didn't react to my voice. It didn't even seem to acknowledge me, its focus entirely on Mia. But as I pulled harder, something strange happened. I could feel the shadow shift. It wasn't just a presence in the room anymore, it was part of the room, a manifestation of something older, darker, and far more malevolent than I'd imagined. And then, with a sudden, jarring release, Mia collapsed into my arms. I nearly fell over, my heart thudding in my chest as I pulled her away from the center of the room. She was coughing, gasping for air, her body trembling. I saw it, she whispered between breaths. It was inside me. I felt the blood drain from my face. What do you mean inside you? She shuddered, her eyes wide, as though she was seeing something I couldn't. It spoke to me, in my head. It wants you. A chill raced down my spine. I helped her to her feet, guiding her toward the door. We have to get out. Now. But as I turned the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I pulled harder, but it was as if the entire house had sealed itself off, trapping us inside. The whispers swirled around us again, more urgent now, and I could see the shadows starting to move, flowing like liquid across the walls, stretching its form toward us. I backed up, Mia clutching my arm. What does it want? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. It's coming for you, Mia rasped, her voice faint, as though whatever had been inside her had drained her completely. It's always been you. I stared at the shadow, its shape shifting again, now towering above us, its features becoming grotesque, demonic. And then, with a sickening clarity, I realized the truth. The shadow wasn't just something from my room. It was a part of me, a darkness that had been growing within, waiting for the right moment to take me. My heart raced as the room grew darker, the daylight fading away as if consumed by the entity itself. There was no escaping it. No light could save me now. The shadow was coming for me, and this time, there would be no morning to chase it away. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and as the shadow enveloped me, I heard the final, clear voice in my ear, "You belong to me." Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Seeker in the Shadows. It started when I was 8, when everything seemed more innocent than it really was. My house, a sprawling old Victorian relic my parents bought for its charm, had always felt too large, too dark, and too full of forgotten places. There were rooms we never used, dusty corners that no one had touched in years, and an attic that groaned as if it had a voice of its own. It was in this house that I met him, my imaginary friend. At least, that's what I called him back then. I named him Isaac. He appeared one day when I was playing hide and seek alone. I was too young to feel self-conscious about talking to an empty room, so I invited him into the game. "Come find me," I whispered into the shadows, half joking, half expecting nothing in return. But something answered. At first, it was just the creak of the floorboards, the soft whisper of movement in a house that should have been still. I thought it was the wind, or my overactive imagination, but then I heard it, footsteps that weren't mine. "Found you," Isaac said, though I never saw him. I only felt his presence. I wasn't scared at first. Why would I be? I was a child, and children don't question the invisible. He was my companion, my playmate in a house that always felt too empty. We played all the time, especially hide and seek. I was always the one hiding, of course. Isaac liked to seek. His voice was always nearby, but I never saw him, not really. Not until much later. My parents dismissed Isaac as just a figment of my imagination. "You'll grow out of it," they said with a smile that never quite reached their eyes. But I didn't. Isaac stayed with me as I grew older, though the games changed. He grew more possessive. The whispers grew louder, his voice more insistent. "Hide better," he would urge. "If I find you too quickly, the game won't be fun." It became harder to tell when the game started and when it ended. Sometimes, I would lie awake at night, feeling his presence outside my door, waiting for me to play again. It wasn't until the night of my 12th birthday that I began to truly understand what Isaac was. The house had always felt strange, but on that night, it felt alive. The shadows seemed to stretch and bend, watching me, and the air turned colder with every breath I took. I could hear him pacing outside my room, his footsteps heavier now. "Come out," Isaac said, his voice no longer playful, but demanding. "It's my turn." I refused to leave my room, hoping it would all stop if I stayed quiet. But it didn't. Isaac was no longer just a voice, no longer an imaginary friend. He had become something else, something real. And he was tired of playing by my rules. I didn't sleep that night. Isaac's voice haunted me from the hallway, his words a constant reminder that the game wasn't over. "Come out," he said, with a soft tap against the door. You're not hiding very well. My heart raced as I pulled the blanket over my head, desperate to disappear beneath the thin fabric. Every inch of my body screamed for me to move, to run, but fear had rooted me in place. Morning came, but the dread didn't lift with the rising sun. My parents were oblivious, asking why I looked so tired, brushing off my fears as childish nightmares. It's just a phase, my mother said while folding laundry. But they couldn't feel the cold that followed me, or hear the footsteps when no one was there. Isaac wasn't a phase, and whatever he was getting stronger. I could sense him everywhere now, lurking in the corners of my vision, slipping through the cracks in the walls. I avoided the attic where we used to play, but Isaac found other places to stalk me. The dark basement, the long hallways, even my own room felt unsafe. One evening, as I lay in bed, I heard a familiar sound, the low, deliberate creak of footsteps. But this time, they weren't in the hallway. They were under my bed. I froze, holding my breath, too terrified to even shift my legs. "I'm closer than you think," Isaac whispered from beneath the mattress. The sound of his voice was different now, deeper, distorted, as if the years of waiting had twisted something inside him. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping, praying that it was just a bad dream. But then I felt it, the slow, deliberate brush of something cold against the soles of my feet. I shot up, leaping out of bed and pressing myself against the wall. For the first time, I could feel his presence so close, too close. His outline, faint but visible in the dim light, seemed to stretch and distort, rising from the floor like smoke. His form was human, but wrong. His arms were too long, his fingers claw-like, and his face. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me, the same way it had when we first played hide and seek. "You can't run forever," he said, his voice an eerie mix of the child I once knew and something much darker. "It's my turn to hide now." "But you have to find me?" Isaac didn't wait for a reply. His shadow evaporated, disappearing into the walls, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my room. The rules had changed. Isaac wasn't just seeking me anymore. He wanted me to find him. But where had he gone? And what would happen if I did? For days, Isaac didn't return, at least not in the way I'd grown used to. The house, always oppressive with its heavy shadows and creaking timbers, seemed to breathe easier in his absence. But I knew better. Isaac was hiding now, and he expected me to find him. That thought alone kept me on edge, wondering, waiting for him to appear in the corner of my eye or call out from the dark. One evening, when the sky outside had turned a dull, bruised shade of purple, I heard something. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint knock from above. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the book I had been pretending to read, but the sound came again. Then again. It was coming from the attic. My throat tightened as I remembered the games we played there when I was younger. I had vowed never to go back to that part of the house, but now, Isaac was calling me to him. I grabbed a flashlight, the only weapon I had against the growing darkness in my mind, and crept up the narrow staircase. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself was trying to hold me back. The air thickened with every breath I took, musty and cold, smelling of damp wood and forgotten things. I reached the door to the attic, my hand trembling as I turned the rusted knob. The door groaned open, revealing the shadowy expanse beyond. At first glance, the attic looked just as I remembered, dusty, cluttered with old trunks and boxes that had been left untouched for years. But then I saw it, in the far corner, behind an old chest, a small figure crouched in the dark. My heart leapt into my throat. "Isaac?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. The figure didn't move at first, and for a moment, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then, slowly, it stood. Taller than it should have been. Much taller. My flashlight flickered, casting brief flashes of light across the figure. It wasn't Isaac, not the way I remembered him. What stood before me was a twisted version of him, his once childlike form warped and elongated, his face lost in shadow. Only his eyes glowed, a pale, sickly light that pierced through the gloom. "Why did you stop playing?" His voice had changed, deeper, more hollow. It echoed around the room, bouncing off the walls as if the house itself were speaking to me. "You were always so good at hiding. But now, you have to find me." His figure darted across the room, impossibly fast, disappearing behind the rafters with a sickening laugh that seemed to crawl under my skin. I ran, not caring about the noise I made, stumbling down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the kitchen, where my parents sat, oblivious to the terror I had just witnessed. "What's wrong?" my father asked, looking up from the newspaper, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I? How could I tell them that the boy I once called my friend was now something far more dangerous? But as I stood there, panting, I realized something chilling. Isaac wasn't just playing anymore. He was hunting. And I was still a part of his game. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a labyrinth, designed to trap me in Isaac's game. The creaks and groans of the walls, the flicker of shadows on the edge of my vision, everything seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if Isaac's presence had seeped into the very bones of the place. He was everywhere and nowhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always just one step behind me. The night that everything changed was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes you feel like you're suffocating. My parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me alone in the house. I thought about calling them, telling them that something was wrong, that I needed help. But what could I say? I couldn't even bring myself to admit the truth. Instead, I sat in my room, my eyes darting to the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. It came sooner than I expected. The lights flickered, and then, with a sharp crack, the house plunged into darkness. I grabbed my phone, the screen casting a dim glow, but before I could dial, my phone died. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Then I heard it, Isaac's voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the hallway. "Come find me," he whispered, and then, more playfully, "or I'll find you." I didn't want to play his game anymore, but I had no choice. If I stayed still, he would come for me. If I ran, he would enjoy the chase. Trembling, I stepped into the hallway, my heart thudding in my chest. The darkness was so thick it felt like I was walking through ink. I could hear him everywhere, his footsteps echoing off the walls, his laughter bouncing from room to room. I descended the stairs, my feet barely making a sound. I knew where I had to go. The basement, the only place left where I hadn't searched for him. The door to the basement loomed ahead of me, slightly ajar, and from the gap, a cold draft flowed out, carrying with it a whisper of Isaac's voice. "Down here. I'm waiting." I pushed the door open and descended into the blackness, gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. The air was heavy, damp, and filled with the smell of earth. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight barely cutting through the dark. The basement was vast, lined with old shelves and broken furniture, but I could feel him there, watching me. "You're close," Isaac whispered, his voice coming from everywhere at once. "But not close enough." I spun around, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand, but I saw nothing. Then, I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the floor behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and saw him. Isaac stood in the center of the room, his form fully visible now. His limbs were long and twisted, his skin pale and stretched too tight over his bones. His face was no longer human. Hollow eyes stared back at me, black and endless, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. "Found you," he said, his voice now a guttural growl. Before I could scream, he lunged, his cold hands grabbing hold of me. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but his grip was iron, pulling me deeper into the darkness. "You've played long enough," he hissed. "Now, it's my turn to hide. But this time, you won't be able to find me." Everything went cold, and the last thing I saw was his twisted smile before the darkness swallowed me whole. The game was over. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The Whispers of Tomorrow. I never should have ventured out that night. The wind carried a strange song, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves against stone, but soon it grew clearer, unmistakable. It whispered my name, Ben. It came from the woods behind my house, where the towering oaks swayed like giants in a slow, restless dance. Something about the voice unsettled me. It was too familiar, yet I couldn't place it. Maybe that's why I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the shadows, curiosity outweighing caution. The moment I crossed into the forest, the wind died. It was so sudden, like someone had hit the pause button on the world. The quiet was thick, oppressive, the kind that makes your ears ring. That's when I heard it again, clearer this time. Ben. It wasn't just the wind. There was intent behind it, a weight that made my heart stutter in my chest. The voice was no longer distant, it was close, just beyond the next cluster of trees. Despite every nerve in my body telling me to turn back, I pressed forward, the underbrush crunching beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The air grew colder, biting at my skin, and the trees seemed to lean in, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even my flashlight struggled to cut through the darkness. That's when I noticed the first grave. A simple stone, weathered and worn, sticking up from the earth like a forgotten relic. The date was what stopped me cold, October 2nd. Tomorrow. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced for a rational explanation, but before I could think, the voice called again, stronger this time. Ben, this way. I couldn't resist. My feet moved on their own, pulling me toward another grave, then another. Each one bore the same date, October 2nd. A growing sense of dread gnawed at me, like icy fingers wrapping around my spine. Finally, I reached a clearing, and there it stood, a figure, cloaked in shadow, hunched over a grave marked with my name. I froze, my flashlight flickering weakly in my trembling hand. The figure didn't move, but the voice, it didn't need to speak anymore. The whisper was inside my head now, echoing louder than the wind ever could. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face I could only describe as hollow, eyes sunken deep into dark sockets, lips curled in a twisted smile. You should never have followed, it rasped, the words slithering from its mouth like a dying breath. I stumbled back, my heart pounding against my ribcage, the flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling into the dirt. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence tightening around me, like the air itself was thickening. My breath came in ragged gasps as I glanced at the grave it stood over, my grave. There, etched in the stone as clear as day, was my name, Benjamin Hall, and the same chilling date, October 2nd. Tomorrow. No, this can't be. I muttered, my voice trembling. The wind, once a whisper, picked up again, but now it sounded like a chorus, dozens of voices murmuring my name from all directions. Each one was more urgent, more frantic, like they were warning me, or worse, urging me on. I turned in every direction, trying to locate the source, but the trees stood still, looming like silent sentinels in the dark. The figure in the clearing remained motionless, but I could feel it watching me, waiting for something. I wanted to run, to tear myself away from this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't move. I was anchored to the spot, paralyzed by fear or some unseen force. My mind spun, grasping for logic, for reason, but there was none to be found. I was staring at my own grave, a grave that claimed I would die tomorrow. Why? Why me? I whispered, more to myself than to the figure. The words felt hollow, pointless, but they echoed in the empty space around me. You were called, it answered, its voice scraping like nails on stone. It was your turn to hear the wind. The words sent a shiver down my spine, colder than any wind I'd felt that night. My turn? The figure's words carried a weight that felt ancient, like it was speaking a truth far older than anything I could understand. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to take a step back, but the ground beneath me shifted. I looked down, horrified, as the earth began to sink, the graves around me pulling themselves open, gaping like black mouths. I screamed, panic finally taking over as I tried to claw my way out of the sinking dirt. My fingers scraped against roots and stones, but it was no use. The ground itself seemed to want me, pulling me down with the same inexorable force that had led me into the forest. And all the while, the wind held my name, a constant reminder that I had been chosen. Just as the dirt reached my knees, I heard something, a voice, faint but human. Ben. Ben, are you out here? It was Sarah, my neighbor. Her voice cut through the nightmare like a beacon, giving me the strength to fight against the pull of the earth. I gasped for breath and pushed harder, the ground loosening its grip just enough for me to stumble forward, away from the grave. "Sarah!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "I'm here." I ran toward the sound of her voice, my legs burning with exhaustion, my mind reeling from what I had just seen. The graves, the figure, the wind, it couldn't be real. It couldn't. But as I broke through the trees and saw Sarah's flashlight bobbing in the distance, I knew that I had only escaped for now. When I reached her, she looked at me with concern etched deep in her face. "Ben, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to answer, but the wind cut through the trees again, carrying a final whisper that chilled me to the core. Tomorrow. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the graves, those cold, damp markers waiting for something inevitable. I tossed and turned, the sound of the wind's whispers haunting my every thought. Sarah had insisted on walking me back to my house after I emerged from the woods, but no matter how much I tried, I couldn't explain what I'd seen. It sounded too insane, even to my own ears. She had finally left after making me promise to call her if anything felt off. But what was I supposed to say? That the forest had whispered my name and shown me my own grave? The clock on my nightstand read 3 a.m., and despite the exhaustion weighing down my body, I couldn't shake the sense of something lingering in the shadows. The darkness in my room felt too thick, too alive. My breath came out in shallow gasps as the minutes crept by. I was waiting for something, though I didn't know what. Then, the wind outside picked up again, gently rattling the windows. "Ben." The voice whispered once more, as if it had followed me home. I sat up, my heart racing. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was inside the house. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor as I strained to listen. There was something wrong with the air, something oppressive that made it hard to breathe. My skin prickled with an invisible charge. I could feel it, the same presence from the woods, lurking in the corners of my room. I stood up slowly, my body trembling, and walked toward the hallway. As I stepped into the narrow space, I stopped cold. There, at the far end of the hall, was a shape, a shadow darker than the night itself. It hovered, its form shifting slightly, as if it were trying to take shape. I blinked, hoping I was imagining it, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there, closer now. I could hear it breathing, the raspy sound of air dragging through unseen lungs. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as fear clawed its way up my throat. The figure didn't answer, but the wind outside howled again, louder this time, as if responding for it. The shadow drifted toward me, slow and deliberate, its movement unnatural, like it was being pulled by strings. I stepped back instinctively, my back hitting the wall behind me. Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered, and for a split second, the shadow was gone. But in that brief moment of darkness, a voice filled the air around me, not a whisper this time, but a clear, unmistakable command: "Leave." The lights came back on, and the shadow was gone, but the air felt heavy with its presence. I rushed back to my room, grabbed my phone, and dialed Sarah. The ringing seemed to last forever before she finally picked up, her voice groggy. "Ben? What's wrong?" I don't know," I stammered, pacing the floor. "It's here. Something's here." "What do you mean?" she asked, more awake now. "Are you still in the house?" I hesitated, then nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, but I don't think I can stay here. I think it followed me from the woods." My voice broke, the panic finally creeping in. "Ben, listen to me. Stay calm. I'm coming over, okay? Don't do anything until I get there." She hung up before I could protest, leaving me standing in the eerie silence of my room. The wind had died down outside, but I could still feel the weight of something unseen. Whatever had marked me for death tomorrow wasn't done yet. It was watching. Waiting. And I couldn't escape it. By the time Sarah arrived, the air in my house felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. She burst through the door, her eyes wide with concern, but as soon as she stepped inside, she hesitated. I could see it in her face, she felt it too. The weight of something lurking in the shadows, something unnatural. She took a deep breath and hurried toward me, wrapping her arms around me as if her presence could push back the encroaching darkness. "We have to go," she said firmly, her voice breaking the thick silence that had settled in the house. "Something is wrong here, Ben. I can feel it." "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But where do we go?" "It's not just the house, Sarah. It's out there, too. In the woods. In the wind." She pulled back, looking me in the eye. "Then we leave town. We get as far away from here as we can. Tonight." Her words made sense, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Whatever had marked me wouldn't just let me walk away. It wasn't something that could be outrun or escaped. It was a part of me now, like a shadow I couldn't shake. But I nodded, desperate for some kind of action, some kind of hope, however fleeting. I grabbed a few things, a jacket, my phone, keys, and we rushed to the car. The night outside was eerily still. No wind, no whispers. Just silence. It felt like the calm before a storm. As we drove down the empty streets, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure from the woods, or worse, the shadow that had haunted my hallway. But the road behind us was empty. "Ben, talk to me," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "What did you see in the woods? What's happening to you?" I hesitated. I hadn't told her everything yet, not about the graves with tomorrow's date, not about the voice that had called my name since the moment I'd stepped outside. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But I knew I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. "There were graves, Sarah," I said quietly. "Graves with my name on them. And the date. It's tomorrow." Her hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. "That doesn't make any sense, Ben. It can't be real. You're not going to die tomorrow." "I saw it," I insisted, my voice cracking. "And there was something in the woods. It knew me. It was waiting for me." Suddenly, the wind picked up outside the car, swirling around us like a cyclone. Sarah cursed under her breath, gripping the steering wheel as the car veered to the side of the road. The trees ahead swayed violently, their branches bending and cracking as the wind howled through them. And then, just as quickly as it started, the wind stopped. Everything fell into an eerie silence once again. I glanced at Sarah, and she looked back at me, her face pale. We were both holding our breath. That's when I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable, my name. "Ben." I froze. Sarah's eyes widened, and she turned toward me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly, the pit in my stomach growing deeper. The voice came again, louder this time, coming from all around us, from the trees, from the wind, from the very air itself. "Ben. Tomorrow." And then, without warning, the ground in front of the car began to shift. The earth trembled, and slowly, impossibly, a shape began to emerge from the dirt. A gravestone. My gravestone. It stood there, solid and cold, the date staring back at me, October 2nd. Tomorrow. I screamed. Sarah threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. The wind howled louder, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all chanting my name, all beckoning me toward the grave. The air grew thick, suffocating, as shadows crept toward us, stretching long fingers across the road. "Ben!" Sarah shouted, reaching for me, her voice filled with terror. But it was too late. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the final whisper, soft and cold, like a breath on the back of my neck. "Your time has come." The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.